We have all grown up completely trusting maps. We look at a physical atlas, or now, we just boot up the GPS app on our phones, and we assume that whatever is shown on that screen is a precise, verified mirror of reality. Every road, every river, every tiny municipality, they are all recorded. But the reality is, global mapping is not a perfect science. There are administrative errors, boundary disputes, and sometimes places are omitted by design. For a long-distance trucker named Elias, that design was about to manifest as an exit that should not have been there. He was about to find himself in a small town that did not officially exist, and he would discover that the reason for its absence from the database was far more terrifying than a simple clerical mistake. He would learn that sometimes a place is wiped off the map not by an algorithm, but as a last-ditch act of self-preservation against a deep-rooted corruption that refuses to be contained. I am always incredibly fascinated by the obscure routes and unlisted roads these stories travel to find you, so while you are getting settled in for this drive, take a quick second to let me know in the comments which city or town you are tuning in from today. In the autumn of 1998, a 42-year-old truck driver named Elias was running a massive 14-speed 18-wheeler loaded with medical supplies from Nashville, Tennessee, toward a specialized facility in Central California. Elias was a seasoned road veteran. He had spent his entire adult life behind that massive steering wheel, and he knew the vast arterial highway system of the United States like the back of his hand. He was a practical, grounded family man, and he took immense pride in his safety record. He never rushed, and he never took shortcuts. He understood that patience was the single greatest asset of a professional driver. The journey began in a perfectly predictable, comforting pattern. Elias watched the rolling green hills of Tennessee transition into the vast, flat agriculture lands of the Midwest. He spent 4 full days pushing through the flat expanse, fueled by strong black coffee and classic country radio. His route was mapped out with military precision, and he was on schedule to hit his mandatory rest stop in a specific trucking plaza just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, by 8:30 p.m. on Thursday night. He was running a modern GPS system for redundancy, but he still preferred to navigate primarily by a laminated physical road atlas he had carried for decades. He trusted ink and paper far more than a digital signal. By 6:45 p.m. on Thursday, Elias was navigating a particularly isolated, winding stretch of 2-lane state highway in the high deserts of eastern Utah. The sun had just slipped below the distant, jagged mountains, plunging the barren landscape into a fast, deep blue twilight. The temperature was dropping fast. Elias glanced at his laminated atlas, confirmed his exit number was 12 miles ahead, and activated his cruise control, looking forward to a hot meal and a 12-hour sleep. 5 minutes later, however, he looked up to see a large, green highway sign that was entirely unexpected. The sign, mounted on massive timber posts, was not the standardized steel he was used to seeing. It looked hand-painted and aged with reflective, slightly cracked white text. It stated that exit 24A, leading to the town of Harrow's Creek, was exactly 1 mile ahead. Elias frowned, pulling his physical atlas onto his steering wheel. He squinted at the Utah map under the amber dome light of his cab, tracing his finger along the state road. The atlas showed absolutely nothing between where he was and his final destination stop. No road, no exit, and certainly no town named Harrow's Creek. He looked down at his GPS unit, mounted near his gear shifter. The blue screen showed his rig as a single arrow moving across a perfectly blank, off-grid gray void. A seasoned driver would have ignored it, but Elias was practical, not superstitious. He knew that physical atlases and even digital maps carried legacy errors, omissions, or simply lagged behind new development. His primary concern was efficiency. The sign's typeface implied Harrow's Creek was a established, old agricultural town. Logic told him that a town meant services, services meant food, and perhaps even a faster route. If his atlas was wrong about the town, maybe it was also wrong about a faster agricultural cut-through that could save him 50 miles. He had seen it happen before in Oklahoma and Texas. Trusting his seasoned instinct over a laminated map, Elias activated his turn signal and navigated the massive 14-speed semi-trailer down the unexpected off-ramp. The off-ramp was surprisingly short, immediately dead-ending into a narrow, winding, brick-paved two-lane road that punched directly into a dense, unnatural cluster of tall, ancient pine trees. As Elias drove his rig through the trees, the amber glow of his headlights was immediately choked out by the canopy. The silence of the desert was replaced by a localized, pressurized hush, and the powerful, reassuring thrum of his massive diesel engine seemed to quiet down, as if the forest was actively absorbing the sound. He checked his side mirrors, realizing the main highway was already lost in the visual static of the trees and a localized freezing fog. The brick road snaked for another 2 miles before the trees finally gave way to a perfectly manicured, small-town main street. Harrow's Creek, Utah was a picture-perfect time capsule from roughly 1955. The street was lined with neat 2-story buildings built from local red desert stone and dark-aged wood. There were polished vintage sedans parked along the curbs, the chrome catching the light. The storefront signs still advertised brands and logos that had been discontinued decades prior. Elias navigated his massive 18-wheeler down the center of the brick street, looking for any sign of life. By his estimation, it was now 7:15 p.m. In any other small American town, the sidewalks would be active with families, commuters, or workers closing down shops. He looked through the massive plate glass windows of the general store, the pharmacy, and the diner. Everything looked clean, fully stocked, and operational. But the buildings were entirely dark. The streets were entirely silent. There were no pedestrians, no laughter, and no casual chatter. Not even a stray cat crossed the street. The entire town felt paused, a perfect, sterile museum exhibit that was waiting for an opening day that had never arrived. Elias finally spotted a small, humble gas station at the far end of the street. It was a vintage service station with those old-fashioned, globe-top gasoline pumps that had not been in regular use in 30 years. A warm, yellow, incandescent light was spilling from the window of the small brick office. Elias pulled his truck onto the concrete apron, letting the engine idle with a rhythmic, thunderous rumble that felt like a localized earthquake in the town's unnatural hush. He stepped out of the cab, the intense desert cold immediately stinging his face. He checked his laminated atlas once more, tracing the blank area, but the page was now blurred as if by a sudden, unseen dampness. He walked to the gas station office, pushed the glass door open, and stepped into the warm interior. The air inside smelled strongly of ozone, stale coffee, and old dust-covered agricultural ledgers. Sitting on a stool behind the scratched Formica counter was an extremely old man wearing a faded, button-up service station uniform. His skin was pale and waxy, entirely devoid of wrinkles, and his face was entirely smooth and pixelated, a generic, uniform structure that made him almost impossible to classify. He was staring blankly at a copy of a local newspaper on the counter. When Elias walked in, the old man did not look up. He remained perfectly motionless, his blank face aimed at the paper. Elias asked the man for directions to Salt Lake City, but he minimalized the dialogue by adding narration. He explained he had seen the sign and figured it was a shortcut. The old man said that Harrow's Creek was not a shortcut, and it was not on his way to anywhere. His voice was a flat, digital monocanal monotone that carried zero emotion or inflection, sounding like a very old, compressed audio file being played back through a broken speaker. Elias asked him again, trying to provide context about his mapping. The old man continued to stare at the newspaper and minimizing the interaction by narrating. He stated that Elias was looking at an old paper and his mapping was outdated. He said that this town did not exist on any database, and the reason for its omission was the very problem Elias was currently witnessing. The old man slowly turned his head to look directly at Elias. He said that once a corruption in the system becomes too deep, the only option is administrative omission. They wiped the data, and they omitted the code. But the physical logic cannot always be contained. Elias felt a sudden, sharp wave of dizziness wash over him. He looked down at the laminated atlas still in his hand. He looked up at the old man's waxy, pixelated face. The old man nodded slowly, confirming that Elias had made a grave error. He said that anyone who stays in Harrow's Creek for more than 12 minutes is folded into the omission. He stated that Elias was looking right at the edge of that process. He slowly reached up and pointed his thin, pale finger at Elias's chest. He said that the real reason Elias's laminated paper could not display the town was that the paper had already accepted the administrative void. It was not waiting for an update. It was recognizing that Elias himself had already begun to fade from its reality. The moment he had activated that turn signal based on an antiquated, hand-painted sign, he had given the data corruption permission to overwrite his path. The old man went right back to staring at the newspaper, becoming instantly motionless and silent again, as if Elias was no longer in the room. Elias stumbled backward out of the gas station, bursting out into the freezing desert air. He looked at his side mirrors. He looked at his laminated atlas. He realized that the ink and paper was now just a giant, blurry smear, a visual artifact of the administrative omission taking root. The entire street of vintage cars was perfectly silent. A pair of pale, wrinkled, elderly hands were now holding a copy of a local newspaper that was completely blank, just white sheets of paper. Elias scrambled into the cab of his 18-wheeler. He looked down at the GPS screen. The entire void of gray was now glowing with a strange pale green hue, and a single scrolling line of text read Experiment 7, the town that forgot everything, active. Elias realized with soul-crushing finality that Harrow's Creek was not a physical place he could escape. It was a psychological state, a localized loop of forgetting created by the deep, technological corruption that refuses to be contained. By trusting his seasoned instinct over the laminated safety of the database, he had not found a shortcut. He had provided the corruption the administrative code it needed to reach into the database vault and completely wipe the slate of his own identity. Elias is still out there, still driving the brick street of that perfect paused museum exhibit. He has not found a gas station that gives him an answer, and he has not found the highway exit. But every year, when the mapping company drives through the Utah desert with its new specialized backpack cameras, the automated software captures a temporary data artifact before automatically deleting it due to a data corruption error. If you look closely enough at the unmapped grid gray void, you will see a massive 30-year-old laminated road atlas lying on the physical ground, its blank pages already faded into a pale, perfect administrative void, and if you listen carefully, you might catch the faint, industrial thunder of a diesel engine that has long since fallen into the omission. We spend our entire lives investing in a timeline we believe is permanent, assuming that our memories, our families' faces, and the very ground we walk on are etched into our biological code. But we forget that memory is not a safe vault. It is a fragile series of electrical impulses bouncing across microscopic pathways in the dark. Without the structure of our past and the patience to wait for a verified path, we are just empty data waiting to be directed. True safety is not found in chasing an impulsive shortcut, but in having the courage to trust the process, even when the data fails, because some corruptions can never be contained, they can only be forgotten. I am always incredibly curious about how far these strange, digital, unmapped roads travel through the internet to find you. So while you are getting comfortable for your own drive, take a quick second to tell me in the comments the exact town or city where you are tuning in from today. We will be returning with another strange, dark, and mysterious story very soon. Until then, Stay safe.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We post new stories as often as possible, so if that is something you are into, please go ahead and tell the like button that you have a rare, exotic flower to show them in your backyard, but then lead them into a shed and lock the door from the outside. For most people, the suburbs are a place of predictable safety. You have your manicured lawns, your white picket fences, and neighbors who wave to you while they retrieve their morning mail. But for a man named David Miller, a 34-year-old actuary who moved into a quiet cul-de-sac in Connecticut in the fall of 2025, the suburbs were about to become the setting of his worst nightmare. While we get settled into the neighborhood of this mystery, I am dying to know where everyone is joining us from today. Leave a comment with your city or town, especially if you are currently sitting in a house that feels just a little too quiet. David was a man of habit and observation, which is why he noticed almost immediately that the house next door, number 42, had a very specific and very disturbing routine. The neighbor at number 42 was a man in his late 70s named Mr. Henderson. He was a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself during the day. But every single night, without fail, at exactly 12:15 a.m., David would hear the sound of a screen door creaking open. From his second-floor bedroom window, David would watch as Mr. Henderson emerged into his backyard, not with a flashlight, but with a heavy, rusted spade and a large burlap sack that seemed to move on its own. David watched Mr. Henderson for 2 weeks straight. The old man would spend hours on his knees in the dirt, digging deep, narrow holes in a garden that grew nothing but strange, pale white vines. There were no flowers and no vegetables, just these thick, translucent stalks that looked like veins crawling across the earth. Mr. Henderson would reach into the burlap sack, pull something out, and bury it deep. On the night of October 12th, at 2:45 a.m., David's curiosity finally got the better of him. He had been struggling with a sense of stagnation in his own life, a feeling that he was just going through the motions without any real growth. He thought that perhaps if he solved the mystery of his neighbor, it would give him the spark he needed. He put on his dark hoodie and sneakers, crept out his back door, and pressed his face against the wooden slats of the fence separating their properties. The smell hit him first. It was not the smell of fresh earth or mulch. It was the scent of iron and something sweet, like rotting peaches. David peered through a gap in the wood and saw Mr. Henderson standing over a fresh hole. The old man was whispering. It was not a prayer, but a conversation. He was talking to the ground. Mr. Henderson reached into the sack and pulled out a small, leather-bound shoe. It was a child's shoe, worn at the heel. He placed it gently into the hole and began to cover it with dirt, sobbing quietly as he worked. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He pulled out his phone, ready to dial 911, but his thumb hovered over the screen. He needed to be sure. He needed to know if this was a crime or just the madness of a grieving man. The next day, David did some digging of his own, but on the internet, he looked up the history of the property at number 42. He discovered that in 1984, Mr. Henderson's young daughter had vanished from that very backyard. The case had never been solved. For 42 years, the man had lived alone in that house. David should have stopped there. He should have realized that grief can make a person do strange things to keep a memory alive. But David was obsessed with the idea of consequences. He believed that everything in life had a root, and he wanted to see what was at the bottom of Mr. Henderson's garden. On October 15th, at 1:20 a.m., David waited until Mr. Henderson went back inside his house. The lights in number 42 went dark. David climbed over the fence, his heart thumping in his ears like a drum. He walked toward the center of the white vines, the ground feeling soft and spongy beneath his feet. He chose a spot where the dirt looked freshest and began to dig with his bare hands. He dug past the topsoil, past the roots of the pale vines, until his fingers hit something hard. It was not a shoe. It was a bone. A small, delicate radius bone. David froze as he realized, in that moment, that Mr. Henderson was not burying memories, but was trying to grow them back. Suddenly, a hand gripped David's shoulder in a cold, skeletal grip. He turned around to find Mr. Henderson standing there, but the old man did not look angry. He looked exhausted as he held a mirror up to David's face. In the dim moonlight, David saw that his own eyes were beginning to turn the same translucent white as the vines in the garden. David froze, the small radius bone feeling impossibly heavy in his hand as he stared into the silver surface of the mirror. The air seemed to grow thick around him, and the sweet, rot-like scent of the garden intensified until it felt like a physical weight in his lungs. In that moment, the logical, actuarial part of his brain tried to find a rational explanation, but the reality was staring back at him in the pale moonlight. Mr. Henderson was not just burying memories of his missing daughter, he was trying to grow them back. The white vines that David had thought were some strange species of ivy were not plants at all. As he looked closer, he saw that they were pulsing with a faint, rhythmic internal light, like blood moving through a translucent vein. They were a biological anomaly, a predatory fungus that had been fed for over 4 decades on the remains of something that should have been left to rest. The entire backyard was not a garden, but a massive, living organism that had turned the soil into a digestive tract, breaking down the items Mr. Henderson provided to fuel its unnatural growth. A sudden, sharp movement to his left made David jump. One of the white stalks near his foot twitched, then began to slowly coil around the toe of his sneaker. He kicked his foot back, but the ground beneath him felt more like flesh than dirt, sagging and shifting as he moved. He realized then that the burlap sack Mr. Henderson carried every night did not just contain old shoes or toys. The way it moved on its own suggested something far more sinister. The old man was scavenging, perhaps even hunting, to provide the organic matter the garden demanded to keep the ghost of his daughter alive. The hand on David's shoulder tightened its grip. It was not a violent grab, but the fingers felt like dry, cold sticks pressing deep into his skin. David spun around, his heart nearly stopping, and found himself face to face with Mr. Henderson. The old man did not look like a murderer or a monster. He looked exhausted, his skin hanging loose on his frame and his eyes sunken deep into his skull. In the silence of the night, the only sound was the wet, rhythmic pulsing of the vines beneath their feet. Mr. Henderson did not speak at first. He just stood there, the mirror still held aloft, forcing David to look at the milky, translucent film spreading across his own pupils. In the dim, silver glow of the moon, David did not recognize the man looking back at him. His skin had taken on a sickly, grayish hue. The neighbor leaned in closer, his breath smelling of that same iron and rotting fruit. He whispered that the garden requires more than just bones and old leather. It is a hungry, sentient thing that feeds on more than just the physical. It requires a witness. The old man explained that it requires someone to hold the crushing weight of the grief when the original gardener can no longer stand beneath it. Mr. Henderson told him that he had been waiting for someone like David, someone who looked too long into the shadows because their own life felt empty. David tried to pull away, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very marrow in his bones was turning to lead. He looked down and saw that the white vines had moved with incredible speed, wrapping tightly around his ankles and calves. They were not just touching him, they were beginning to fuse with the fabric of his jeans, the tiny cilia on the vines hooking into the fibers. He realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that his own dissatisfaction with his life, his search for meaning in the dark corners of his neighbor's yard, had made him the perfect soil for this darkness to take root. He had sought out a mystery because he was bored with the predictable safety of the suburbs, and now He was being absorbed into the very tragedy he had tried to observe from a distance. He opened his mouth to scream for help, to call out to any neighbor who might be awake at 2 a.m., but his throat felt like it was filled with dry silt and thick, dusty earth. The sound that came out was nothing more than a wet, muffled wheeze. Mr. Henderson leaned in even closer, his face inches from David's. He told David that the transition was the hardest part, but once the garden took hold, the loneliness would finally disappear. The old man's voice was almost kind, which made the situation feel even more perverted. He explained that for 42 years, he had been the only one who knew the truth, the only one who kept the daughter's essence from fading into nothingness. But he was tired. He was so very tired of digging. David struggled against the vines, but the more he moved, the deeper his feet sank into the soft, hungry earth. He could feel the coldness of the soil beginning to seep into his shoes, creeping up toward his skin. He looked toward his own house, seeing the familiar silhouette of his bedroom window where he had sat just hours ago, feeling so safe and superior. Now, that life seemed like a dream belonging to a completely different person. Mr. Henderson reached out and gently took the radius bone from David's trembling hand. He looked at it with a strange sort of reverence before turning his gaze back to David. He told David that he was sorry it had to be him, but the garden chooses its own successors. Then, the old man did something that broke David's remaining resolve. He reached back and produced the heavy, rusted spade, its handle slick with decades of sweat and dirt. The weight of the tool was immense as Henderson pressed it into David's hands. As David's fingers closed around the wooden handle, he felt a sharp, stinging sensation in his palms. He looked down and saw thin, white filaments emerging from the wood, piercing his skin and weaving themselves into his nerves. He was no longer just standing in the garden. He was being grafted into it. Mr. Henderson began to back away toward his house, his form fading into the shadows of the porch. David tried to move his arms to drop the spade, but his muscles refused to obey. Instead, his body began to bend forward, his back arching, as if compelled by an external force. The spade hit the dirt with a dull thud. Guided by a will that was not his own, David began to dig. He watched in horror as his own hands labored in the dark, carving a deep, narrow trench into the spongy ground. Beside him, the burlap sack began to thrash violently, and a muffled, rhythmic thumping started to come from deep beneath the earth where he was digging, as if something was knocking on a door from the other side. The thumping from beneath the soil grew louder, a frantic, rhythmic beat that vibrated through the wooden handle of the spade and directly into David's marrow. He was a passenger in his own body, watching through milk-white eyes as his hands methodically cleared the earth. Every scoop of the spongy gray soil felt like he was tearing away a piece of his own soul. He realized that the consequence of his curiosity was not just a secret shared, but a life surrendered. He thought about the letters he had never written to his mother and the apologies he had never offered to those he had hurt. He realized too late that sincerity in life is about tending to the people who are still here, not digging up the ghosts of the past. As the hole deepened, the white vines began to pulse with a feverish intensity, their translucent skins stretching and thinning until they were almost invisible. David could see the dark fluid moving within them, a cocktail of grief and ancient biology that was now flowing into his own veins through the filaments in his hands. He looked up and saw Mr. Henderson standing on the back porch of number 42, the old man's silhouette finally straightening as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Henderson did not look back. He simply turned and walked into the dark house, the screen door creaking shut for the very last time. David's hands stopped digging when the hole reached a specific depth. The thumping from below stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like a long, rattling breath being drawn from the bottom of a well. The large burlap sack that had been thrashing beside him suddenly went limp. The white vines began to wrap around David's ankles with a crushing force, pulling him toward the edge of the trench he had just created. He tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry silt, and the only sound that escaped was the whistle of wind through a hollow reed. He fell forward, his face hitting the soft, cold earth. The vines swarmed over him, weaving a thick, pale cocoon that anchored him to the floor of the garden. As the dirt began to slide back into the hole, seemingly of its own accord, David felt a strange, terrifying peace. He was becoming the witness the garden required. He was the new foundation for a tragedy that refused to end. He realized that his own lack of purpose had made him the perfect soil for this darkness to take root. He had sought out a mystery because he was bored with his own reality, and now he was becoming part of someone else's nightmare. The next morning, at 7:30 a.m., the sun rose over the cul-de-sac in Connecticut, casting a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns and white picket fences. A delivery driver stopped at number 42 to drop off a package, but the house was silent and the windows were dark. When he glanced toward the backyard, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The yard was perfectly flat, covered in a fresh layer of green sod that looked like it had been there for years. There were no white vines, no holes, and no sign of the elderly Mr. Henderson. In the house next door, at number 43, David Miller's laptop was still open on his desk, his half-finished coffee sitting cold next to it. His car remained in the driveway, and his mail began to pile up in the box. When the police eventually arrived, after his employer reported him missing, they found the house in perfect order. They checked the backyard of number 42, but found nothing suspicious except for one small, puzzling detail. In the very center of the empty green yard, they found a single leather-bound shoe sitting on top of the grass, worn at the heel, and smelling faintly of rotting peaches. If you are ever tempted to look too closely at the shadows in your neighbor's yard, just remember that some things are planted deep for a reason. Once you start digging, you might find that the ground is just as hungry for you as you are for the truth. We will be looking into a series of strange occurrences at a lighthouse off the coast of Maine in our next story, so you definitely do not want to miss that. It is often the holes in our own lives that drive us to dig into the lives of others, forgetting that some depths are meant to remain untouched. True growth is found in the light we share with the living, rather than the darkness we exhume from the dead. There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds? Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, a strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, some bleeding from lacerations, were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced Gloria Ramirez dead. The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases, no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorchinsky, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethyl sulfone. Dimethyl sulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethyl sulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt, where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We post new stories as often as possible, so if that is something you are into, please go ahead and tell the like button that you have found a very rare vintage television set for sale at a garage sale. But when the like button plugs it in, the only thing that broadcasts is a live feed of the like button sitting in its own living room. In our modern world, we are surrounded by signals. They are invisible, passing through our bodies every second of every day. We have Wi-Fi, cellular data, and radio waves. We think of them as harmless tools of convenience. But for a 36-year-old man named Leo Vance, a signal was about to become a doorway to something that should have remained forgotten. Before we get into the details of what Leo found on a dusty VHS tape in late October, I want to see where everyone is checking in from today. Whether you are in a crowded city or out in the middle of nowhere, let me know your location in the comments, especially if the air in your room feels a little heavier than usual. This story takes place in the autumn of 2025 in a rural farmhouse outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Leo Vance was a collector of obsolete technology. He lived alone in a house where the silence was often louder than any noise. His shelves were lined with heavy cathode ray tube televisions, wood-paneled radios, and stacks of magnetic media that most people had thrown away decades ago. Leo was a man who lived in the past because he felt the present was too loud and too fast. He found comfort in the warm hum of vacuum tubes and the physical click of a VCR taking a tape. In late October, Leo visited an estate sale at a dilapidated mansion that had been boarded up since the early 1990s. In the basement, hidden behind a stack of water-damaged boxes, he found a single, unmarked black VHS tape. Unlike the others, this one felt heavier, and the plastic casing was cold to the touch, even in the humid Tennessee air. When he brought it home to his farmhouse, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. He cleaned the tape carefully, sat down in his recliner, and pushed the cassette into his favorite top-loading player. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing but static. It was that thick, grainy white noise that used to fill the screens of Middle America after the broadcast stations went off the air for the night. But as Leo watched, he noticed that the static was not random. It seemed to be moving in patterns, forming shapes that looked like faces screaming in a blizzard. He leaned forward, his ears popping as the air pressure in the room suddenly shifted. Then the audio changed. The harsh hiss of the static began to modulate, turning into a low, vibrating hum that made the floorboards beneath his feet tremble. Through the hum, a voice began to emerge. It was a masculine voice, distorted and layered with 1,000 whispers, but it was unmistakably calling Leo's name. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He reached for the remote to turn the volume down, but the buttons did not respond. The television screen began to glow with a brilliant violet light that illuminated the entire living room. The shapes in the static finally coalesced into a clear image. Leo saw a black and white recording of a hallway. He recognized it immediately. It was the hallway of his own farmhouse, but it looked different. The wallpaper was new, and the door at the end of the hall, which he had kept locked and bolted since the day he moved in, was standing wide open. In the video, a young boy and a woman were standing in the doorway. They were looking directly at the camera, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a look of absolute desperation. The woman's mouth was moving, but the only sound coming from the speakers was that deep, rhythmic hum. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered, and the camera panned down to the floor. Leo saw a pair of boots walking toward the woman and the child. He recognized those boots. They were the ones he was currently wearing. He looked down at his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. On the screen, the figure in the boots reached out a hand and touched the woman's shoulder. At the exact same moment, Leo felt a heavy, freezing pressure on his own left shoulder, as if someone were standing directly behind his recliner in the empty house. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the violet glow, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But when he looked back at the television, the woman in the video was no longer looking at the camera. She was looking at something just behind the lens, and her expression had shifted from desperation to pure, unadulterated terror. She raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the corner of the screen. Leo followed her finger and saw a dark, shadowy figure beginning to emerge from the static itself. Its long, spindly limbs reaching out from the glass of the television and into his living room. Leo sat paralyzed as the long, spindly limbs continued to stretch out from the glass of the cathode ray tube television. The violet light was so intense now that it seemed to be liquefying the shadows in the corners of his living room. The sound coming from the speakers had shifted from a low hum to a wet, rhythmic tearing noise, like heavy fabric being pulled apart by invisible hands. On the screen, the black and white hallway was distorting, the walls bending and bowing as if the farmhouse in the video were being crushed by an external force. The shadowy figure in the static leaned forward until its head emerged from the glass. It did not have a face in the traditional sense. Its head was a smooth, featureless oval of shifting gray pixels that hummed with a high-frequency vibration. Leo tried to stand up, but the freezing pressure on his shoulder had spread down his spine, locking his joints in place. He watched in a state of pure adrenaline-fueled horror as the entity reached out with a hand that had 7 long, needle-like fingers. The hand brushed against the arm of his recliner, and the fabric instantly turned to a fine gray ash. Through the rhythmic tearing noise, the masculine voice returned, louder and clearer than before. It told Leo that the signal was finally strong enough to close the circuit. It said that for 36 years it had been waiting for someone with enough love for the old ways to act as a bridge. Leo realized with a jolt of terror that his obsession with obsolete technology had not been a harmless hobby. It had been an unconscious effort to tune into a frequency that the modern world had abandoned for a reason. He had been building a beacon, and tonight something had finally answered the call. The woman and the child on the screen were now pounding on the inside of the glass, their silent screams visible in the way their throats strained. The woman's eyes were locked on Leo, and she began to mouth a single word over and over again. It took Leo several seconds to decipher the movement of her lips. She was saying, "Run," but Leo could not move. The violet light began to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, and he felt a sharp, stinging sensation behind his eyes. His vision began to flicker, the colors of his living room bleeding away until everything looked like a grainy, low-resolution recording. Suddenly, the VCR began to smoke. The scent of melting plastic and ozone filled the room, but the tape continued to spin at a furious speed. The figure from the static was now halfway out of the television, its torso elongated and its skin the color of parched bone. It turned its head toward Leo, and the shifting pixels on its face began to form a rough approximation of a human mouth. It whispered that the past is not a place you go to visit, but a place that comes to claim you. Leo's flashlight, which was still clutched in his trembling hand, began to flicker. In the brief pulses of light, he saw that the walls of his living room were changing. The modern paint was peeling away in large, wet chunks to reveal the same floral wallpaper he had seen in the video. The furniture was aging before his eyes, the wood cracking and the stuffing bursting from the seams of his chair. He was being pulled backward through time, or perhaps the house was being overwritten by the memory stored on the magnetic tape. The figure reached for Leo's face, its 7 needle fingers mere inches from his eyes. At that exact moment, the locked door at the end of the real hallway erupted off its hinges with a violent crash. A blast of cold, stagnant air rushed into the living room, carrying the scent of 100 years of dust. Leo heard the sound of heavy boots running toward him from the darkness of the hall. He looked at the television and saw that the figure in the boots had finally reached the woman and the child. On the screen, the man in the boots turned around to face the camera. It was not a stranger. It was Leo, but he looked 40 years older, his face etched with a lifetime of grief, and his eyes glowing with the same violet light as the television. The older version of Leo reached out a hand and touched the glass from the inside. At the same time, the figure in the room gripped Leo's throat, its touch feeling like 1,000 electric shocks. The older Leo in the video spoke, his voice vibrating through the very floorboards, telling the younger Leo that the only way to save them was to step inside the static. Leo felt his body beginning to blur. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were becoming translucent, the edges of his skin breaking apart into tiny, flickering squares of light. The entity from the television began to pull him toward the screen, its strength irresistible. The violet glow reached a blinding crescendo, and the sound of 1,000 whispers rose to a deafening roar. Just as Leo's face touched the cold, vibrating surface of the glass, he saw the older version of himself smile, and the hand on his throat suddenly shoved him forward into the blizzard of white noise. The violet glow reached a blinding crescendo, and the sound of 1,000 whispers rose to a deafening roar as Leo felt the glass of the television give way like a sheet of ice-cold water. He was not just falling. He was being translated into a series of jagged, electric pulses. The living room of the farmhouse vanished, replaced by a world of monochrome gray where the sky was a flickering ceiling of white noise. He looked down at his own arms and saw that they were composed of millions of tiny, vibrating squares of light. Every memory he had ever cherished was being stripped away, converted into the same magnetic data that filled the shelves of his home. The older version of Leo was standing there, his eyes 2 hollow pits of violet light. He reached out and gripped the younger Leo by the forearms, his touch no longer shocking, but feeling as natural as a heartbeat. The older man leaned in and whispered that the loop was finally complete. He explained that for 40 years, he had been trapped in this pocket of the spectrum, waiting for his younger self to find the tape and provide the energy needed to swap places. He said that in the world of signals, nothing ever truly disappears. It just waits for a receiver to tune in. With a violent, surging motion, the older Leo shoved the younger man backward. Leo felt himself being pushed into the very center of the static blizzard. He tried to cry out, but his voice was now just a burst of high-frequency interference. He watched through the glass of the television as the older Leo stepped out into the living room of the 2025 farmhouse. The older man picked up the flashlight, smoothed his hair, and walked toward the kitchen with a heavy, purposeful gait. The farmhouse door, which had been blown off its hinges, slowly stood itself back up and slid into place, the bolts clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the static world. Leo turned around and saw the woman and the child from the video. They were not ghosts. They were the previous owners of the farmhouse who had made the same mistake in 1992. They looked at Leo with a mixture of pity and hunger. They began to walk toward him, their translucent hands reaching out to share the crushing weight of their eternal isolation, Leo realized that he was now the star of the unmarked black tape, a permanent resident of a frequency that no one would ever purposefully search for again. The next morning, the local deputies arrived at the farmhouse after a neighbor reported a series of strange violet flashes coming from the windows. They found the living room covered in a fine layer of gray dust that looked like ash but felt like powdered glass. The vintage television set was still sitting on the table, but the screen was shattered from the inside out, the glass shards littering the floor like diamonds. The VCR was a puddle of melted black plastic, and the scent of ozone was so thick it made the deputies' noses bleed. There were no signs of Leo Vance. They searched the property for weeks, but they found no footprints and no clues. The only thing the lead investigator found was a single black and white photograph sitting in the center of the recliner. It was a photo of a young man and a woman standing in front of the farmhouse, but as the investigator looked at it, he felt a sharp, stinging pressure in his ears. He saw the figure in the photo, a man who looked exactly like Leo Vance, slowly raise a hand to the camera and place a single flickering finger to his lips. The farmhouse remained empty and boarded up, eventually becoming a place that the locals avoided at all costs. Hikers who passed the property at exactly 12:15 a.m. reported that their battery-powered radios would suddenly cut to a dead channel. They would not hear the news or music. They would only hear the sound of 1,000 whispers merging into one clear, masculine voice that told them the signal was finally strong enough. We often spend our lives surrounded by invisible waves, treating our technology as a harmless comfort without realizing that every signal we send out is a doorway we are leaving unlocked. The past is a broadcast that never truly stops playing, and if we spend too much time listening to the echoes, we might just find ourselves becoming one. It is a sobering thought to realize that our memories are just data stored in a fragile vessel. When we refuse to move forward into the light of the present, we risk being reclaimed by the very shadows we thought we had mastered. When you drive through the pristine, tree-lined suburbs of the American Midwest, you are immediately struck by how uniform and peaceful everything appears. There are perfectly manicured green lawns, white picket fences, and large, beautiful craftsman-style homes where generations of families have raised their kids. We look at these neighborhoods and we assume that the people living inside them are just like the houses themselves, stable, predictable, and safe. But the truth is, suburban architecture is designed specifically to keep the outside world out, which also means it is incredibly effective at keeping secrets in, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not lurking in the deep woods or the dark alleys of a major city. They are sitting right next door, sharing a property line with you, smiling and waving at you across the fence while hiding a reality right beneath their floorboards that would absolutely shatter your understanding of human nature. I am always incredibly fascinated by how far these deep dives travel into the digital wilderness. So while you are getting comfortable, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the country or the world you are watching from today. In the late autumn of 2022, a 38-year-old man named Brian moved into a gorgeous, renovated colonial home on Elm Street in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago, Illinois. Brian was a successful mechanical engineer who had spent the last decade of his life working brutal 60-hour weeks, and this house was his reward. It sat on a massive half-acre lot, flanked by thick oaks that dropped a carpet of deep crimson leaves across his yard. Brian loved the privacy, but more than anything, he loved his neighbors. To his right lived an elderly retired high school history teacher named Arthur. Arthur was a sweet, soft-spoken man in his late 70s who lived completely alone, spent his days tending to his prize-winning hydrangeas, and always wore a faded beige cardigan. He was the quintessential harmless neighborhood grandpa. Because Brian was an engineer, he had a very meticulous mind and a deep obsession with routine. He liked knowing exactly how things worked, and he spent his first few weeks in the house mapping out the plumbing, fixing minor electrical issues, and setting up his basement workshop. His own basement was a standard, clean space with concrete walls and a washer-dryer unit. But because these historic Elm Street homes were built in the early 1920s, they shared an architectural quirk. The basements were incredibly deep, and the heavy concrete foundations were separated by only a thin, shared structural wall underground. By late October, the winter chill had started to settle over Illinois. Brian began spending his evenings down in his basement workshop, restoring old wooden furniture. It was peaceful, silent work. But on a Thursday night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., the silence was broken by a sound that made Brian drop his chisel. It was a low, rhythmic, thumping sound coming from the other side of the concrete wall, directly from Arthur's basement. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy wooden mallet and swinging it against the floor over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. Brian frowned. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to the shared wall, pressing his ear against the cold concrete. The sound stopped the exact second his skin touched the wall. He stood there for 3 full minutes, holding his breath, but the house returned to its absolute silence. Brian shrugged it off, figuring that Arthur was probably just running an old, unbalanced washing machine or maybe fixing a broken pipe in the middle of the night. Elderly people often keep strange hours, and Brian did not want to be the intrusive new neighbor who complained about a minor noise. The next night, however, at 2:12 a.m., Brian was jolted awake in his second-story bedroom. It was not the thumping sound this time, it was a vibration. It felt as if a heavy industrial generator had been turned on right next door, causing the floorboards of his own house to hum with an intense, low-frequency energy. Brian got out of bed, padded down the stairs in his bare feet, and walked down into his basement. The humming was significantly louder down there. It was a deep, guttural resonance that made the water in his laundry sink ripple. He walked over to the shared wall again, and as he reached out his hand, he realized the concrete was hot to the touch. Not warm, but uncomfortably hot, as if a massive furnace was blasting directly on the other side. He tapped his knuckles against the wall, intending to make a polite but firm sound to let Arthur know the noise was traveling. The moment his knuckles struck the concrete, the humming cut out instantly. The sudden silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the room. Brian stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for Arthur to tap back. But nothing happened. The next morning, around 10:30 a.m., Brian saw Arthur out in his front yard raking leaves. He looked completely normal, smiling warmly and waving as Brian walked down the driveway. Brian walked over, intending to bring up the noise in a casual, neighborly way. He asked Arthur if his heating system was holding up okay against the cold, mentioning that he had felt some strange vibrations through the shared wall the night before. Arthur stopped raking. His smile did not fade, but his eyes went completely flat, losing all of their warmth. He stared at Brian for a long, agonizingly silent 5 seconds before speaking in his usual gentle whisper. Arthur said that the old houses on Elm Street have a lot of character, but their old pipes like to sing in the dark. He advised Brian that in a neighborhood like this, the secret to a long, peaceful life is learning to tune out the things that happen underground. Then, without another word, he turned around and walked back into his house, locking the front door behind him. Brian stood on the sidewalk, a cold spike of unease settling deep in his stomach. The phrase turned out the things that happen underground felt less like advice and more like a deliberate, chilling instruction. By the time November arrived, the noises had escalated from a nightly nuisance to a terrifying routine. Every single night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the thumping would begin. It would last for precisely 9 minutes, followed by that intense, burning heat radiating through the concrete wall. Brian stopped sleeping. He became obsessed with the wall, sitting in his basement workshop with the lights turned off, staring at the gray concrete in the dark, waiting for the countdown to begin. He began to notice a smell bleeding through the microscopic cracks in the masonry. It was a sweet, cloying odor that smelled like a mixture of rotten fruit and metallic copper. As an engineer, Brian knew exactly what that smell was. It was the scent of organic decomposition. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, Brian decided he could not take it anymore. He had been tracking the noise for weeks, and his patience had completely evaporated. He was exhausted, paranoid, and consumed by a desperate need for answers. He sat on his workshop stool, watching the digital clock on his phone tick toward the fatal mark. 3:32 a.m., 3:33 a.m. Right on cue, the thumping began. Thud, thud, thud. It was louder tonight, so violent that dust was shaking loose from Brian's ceiling joists. But mixed with the thumping, Brian heard something he had never heard before. It was a voice. It was muffled by the thick concrete, but it was undoubtedly a human voice, high-pitched and ragged, weeping and begging for someone to stop. Brian's blood turned to pure ice. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that Arthur was not fixing pipes. He was not running an old washing machine. Someone was on the other side of that wall, trapped in the dark, and they were running out of time. Brian grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling so much he could barely input the emergency sequence. He dialed 911. He forced his voice into a whisper, telling the dispatcher that he could hear a violent assault occurring in the basement of his neighbor's house at 42 Elm Street. The dispatcher told him to stay inside, lock his doors, and wait for the authorities to arrive. Brian stood at his basement window, his eyes glued to Arthur's house. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the bare oak trees. Brian ran out to meet them, his chest heaving as he pointed toward Arthur's basement windows. 2 officers walked up the front steps and began knocking heavily on Arthur's door. It took several minutes before the lock clicked, and Arthur opened the door. He was wearing his usual beige cardigan, looking confused, fragile, and utterly harmless. Brian watched from the driveway as the officers explained the situation. Arthur nodded meekly, stepping aside and inviting the officers into his home without a single shred of hesitation. Brian waited in the cold night air, certain that the nightmare was finally over. He expected the officers to come bursting out with their weapons drawn, or to call for backup. But 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Finally, the front door opened, and the 2 officers walked out. They were not running. They looked completely relaxed, even laughing quietly as Arthur waved them goodbye from the porch. Brian ran up to the lead officer, demanding to know what they had found in the basement. The officer looked at Brian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told Brian that they had done a thorough sweep of the entire basement. He said there was no furnace, no industrial generator, and certainly no one trapped down there. The officer explained that Arthur's basement was completely empty except for an old wooden workbench and a large, heavy brick pizza oven that Arthur used to bake bread. The officer told Brian that the elderly man was just an old teacher living out his retirement, and that Brian needed to get some sleep and stop harassing his neighbors over the sounds of an old foundation settling. The police cruisers drove away, leaving Brian standing alone in the dark under the cold gaze of Arthur, who remained standing on his front porch. Arthur did not look angry. He just tilted his head to the side, smiled his soft grandpa smile, and raised his hand to give Brian a slow, rhythmic wave before stepping back inside. Brian went back into his house, his mind spinning in a chaotic loop. He knew what he had heard. He knew the heat was real. He knew the smell of decomposition was real. He realized that Arthur was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, a master of deception who had somehow managed to hide an entire chamber of horrors from a pair of trained police officers. Brian went down into his basement workshop one last time. He did not turn on the lights. He walked over to the shared concrete wall, his hands pressing against the surface. It was freezing cold now, the heat completely gone. He realized that the police intervention had changed the game. Arthur knew that Brian was watching. The fragile peace of the neighborhood had been shattered, and there would be a heavy consequence for crossing that property line. As Brian stood there in the absolute darkness of his own basement, he heard a sound that made his breath lock in his throat. It was not coming from Arthur's side of the wall anymore. It was coming from his own side, right behind his back, in the far, dark corner of his own workshop where his old water heater sat. He heard the distinct, rhythmic sound of a heavy wooden mallet being lifted and set down against the concrete floor. Thud, thud, thud. And then a soft, familiar, elderly voice whispered through the dark, thanking him for finally coming down to listen. We spend so much of our lives investing in the illusion of security, believing that a good neighborhood, a friendly smile, and a white picket fence are enough to keep the darkness at bay. But we forget that the people who build the deepest walls are often the ones with the most to hide. And when we go digging into the foundations of our neighbors' lives, we have to be prepared for the reality that we might just become part of the structure they are trying to keep buried. Arthur's yard on Elm Street is still the most beautiful on the block, and the hydrangeas always bloom perfectly every spring. But the new family that moved into Brian's house a few months later has already started complaining to the neighborhood association about a strange, rhythmic thumping that happens right around 3 a.m. I am planning to take a drive down that street next week just to see if the air down there still smells like copper, but until then, I think I will be checking the locks on my own basement door tonight. We will be back with another deep dive into the unexplained very soon. Until then, stay safe. When you look at a map of the northeastern coast of the United States, your eyes will naturally skip right past the tiny, jagged flecks of rock scattered across the cold Atlantic waters. Most of these islands are completely uninhabited, home to nothing but nesting seabirds and crashing waves. But back in the day, before the advent of modern global positioning systems and automated maritime technology, these lonely outposts were absolutely vital to the survival of every ship approaching the mainland. They were home to the lighthouses, massive stone towers that pierced the darkness to guide sailors through treacherous, ship-destroying reefs. The men who operated these towers, the lighthouse keepers, were a very specific breed of human. They had to be comfortable with absolute isolation, brutal winter gales, and weeks on end with no company but their own thoughts. We look at these old stations and we assume the greatest danger those men faced was the wrath of nature, a massive rogue wave or a blinding blizzard. But the truth is, when you lock 3 men on a barren rock miles away from civilization, the most terrifying threat does not always come from the storm outside. Sometimes the isolation acts like a magnifying glass, warping reality until the walls of the stone tower start to close in, and a single, unexplained sound from the dark water below can completely shatter the human mind. I am always incredibly fascinated by the different corners of the world where these historical mysteries end up traveling, so while you are getting settled in and comfortable for this one, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know which state or country you are watching from today. In the late autumn of 1994, a 24-year-old maritime technician named Thomas was assigned to a temporary shift at the Blackwood Rock Light Station. Blackwood Rock was a brutal, jagged tooth of granite sitting roughly 20 miles off the coast of Maine. The station featured a massive 90-foot stone lighthouse tower, a small brick keeper quarters, and a concrete landing platform for the supply boats. The light was fully manual back then, requiring 3 keepers to rotate shifts around the clock to keep the massive generator fueled and the heavy glass lenses perfectly clean. Thomas was filling in for a worker who had gone on medical leave, and he was joined on the rock by 2 seasoned veteran keepers. The head keeper was a stern 55-year-old man named Marcus, who had spent nearly 30 years in the service, and the second keeper was a quiet, meticulous 40-year-old named Jacob. Thomas was excited about the assignment. He was a practical, grounded young guy who looked at the isolation as a great opportunity to read, save some money, and learn from two legends of the coast. When the supply boat dropped him off on a damp, foggy Tuesday afternoon, the air was dead silent. The ocean was as flat as a sheet of glass, and the massive stone tower loomed over the island like a silent gray sentinel. The first 2 weeks on Blackwood Rock passed by in a state of perfectly predictable, comforting routine. Marcus ran the station with military precision. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 a.m., the lenses were polished at 10:30 a.m., and the night watch rotations were split into precise 4-hour blocks. Jacob handled the mechanical logs, spending hours in the basement generator room, ensuring the diesel engines were running smoothly. Thomas fit right into the schedule, finding a deep sense of peace in the mechanical certainty of the work. But on the night of November 12th, the routine broke. Thomas was on the first night watch, sitting in the high watch room directly beneath the massive rotating light. It was exactly 2:15 a.m. The weather was completely calm, with clear skies and a bright crescent moon reflecting off the dark Atlantic water. As Thomas was updating the hourly weather log, he felt a sudden sharp drop in the temperature inside the room. It happened so fast that his breath instantly began to mist in front of his face. At that exact second, the rhythmic industrial thrumming of the diesel generator in the basement completely died out. The rotating light above his head flickered twice and went dark, plunging the entire tower into an absolute, suffocating blackness. Thomas stood up from his desk, turning on his flashlight and directing the beam down the winding stone staircase. In a lighthouse station, a dead light is an absolute emergency. If a ship approached the reef without that warning beam, the consequences would be catastrophic. Thomas began to hurry down the steps, intending to wake Marcus and head to the generator room. But before he could even reach the second landing, the generator suddenly roared back to life with a loud mechanical rumble. The light above clicked back on, sweeping its brilliant white beam across the ocean once again. Thomas paused on the stone steps, letting out a shaky breath. He walked down to the keeper's quarters to see if Jacob had already fixed the issue. He found Jacob sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed in his heavy oilskin jacket, staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee. Thomas asked him what had happened to the generator. Jacob did not look up. He simply stated in a flat, hollow whisper that the engines did not stop because of a mechanical failure. He said the fuel lines were completely clear, but the air in the basement had suddenly turned to ice, and the engines just choked, as if something had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Thomas frowned, rationalizing the event as a simple air pocket in the diesel line. He told Jacob to get some rest and went back upstairs to finish his watch. But the next morning, the atmosphere on Blackwood Rock had completely changed. The calm weather held, but Marcus and Jacob had become strangely distant. During the 10:30 a.m. lens cleaning, Marcus did not speak a single word to Thomas. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands gripping the brass railing of the gallery deck so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Jacob remained in the basement, refusing to come up for lunch. When Thomas went down to check on him, he found Jacob checking the logs over and over again, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. By mid-November, the isolation began to feel less like peace and more like a physical weight pressing down on the island. The daily logs kept by Marcus became increasingly fragmented and bizarre. Thomas, being an analytical person, snuck a look at the logbook on a Thursday evening while the others were asleep. The entries for the past 3 days were written in a jagged, erratic script that looked nothing like Marcus's usual neat handwriting. One entry, dated November 15th at 3:33 a.m., simply read, "The ocean is quiet, but the floorboards are weeping. The men are crying for home, but there is nowhere to walk." Thomas felt a cold spike of unease slide down his spine. The weather data in the log stated there was a severe Category 4 gale hitting the island with 90-mile-an-hour winds. But Thomas knew for an absolute fact that the weather for the past 72 hours had been perfectly calm, with clear skies and a gentle 5-knot breeze. He realized with a jolt of horror that Marcus was experiencing some kind of profound psychological breakdown, hallucinating an entire storm that did not exist outside his own mind. That night at 4:12 a.m., Thomas was jolted awake in his bunk by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was coming from the concrete landing platform outside the quarters. It sounded like a massive, heavy object being dragged slowly across the stone, followed by a wet, rhythmic slapping sound, as if a large piece of saturated canvas was being swung against the brick wall over and over again. Slap, slap, slap. Thomas grabbed his flashlight, slipped on his boots, and padded quietly into the main hallway. The door to Marcus's room was wide open, his bed empty. Thomas crept toward the heavy wooden front door of the quarters, which led out to the landing platform. As he reached out his hand to check the lock, he realized the heavy iron deadbolt had been completely thrown back. The door was unlatched, swinging open an inch in the cold night breeze. Thomas peered through the gap. The island was bathed in pale moonlight. Standing at the very edge of the concrete platform, right where the rock dropped off into 30 feet of black ocean water, were Marcus and Jacob. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, their backs turned to the lighthouse. They were completely naked, their clothes piled neatly on the stone behind them. Thomas watched in absolute horror as Marcus lifted his hands toward the night sky, his chest heaving as he began to weep loudly. Jacob was tilting his head backward, his mouth wide open, making a low, guttural clicking sound that did not sound human. Thomas forced his voice into a whisper, calling out to them from the doorway, begging them to step away from the edge. The exact second his voice carried across the concrete, both men stopped moving. They did not turn around to look at him. Instead, they slowly leaned forward at a perfect 45-degree angle, their bodies remaining completely rigid, and slid silently off the edge of the granite cliff, disappearing into the dark, churning water below without making a single splash. Thomas screamed, running out onto the platform with his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. He shone the light down into the black water, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it was painful. He expected to see them thrashing, fighting the current, or crying for help. He prepared to run to the emergency shed to grab the life rings and dial 911 on the radio. But there was no one in the water. The surface of the ocean was as smooth and undisturbed as a mirror. The pale moonlight reflected perfectly off the black swell, showing absolutely zero bubbles, zero ripples, and zero sign that two grown men had just plummeted into the depths. Thomas backed away from the edge, his breathing ragged, his mind spinning in a chaotic loop of panic and confusion. He ran back into the quarters, locking the heavy wooden door and throwing every bolt. He sprinted up the winding stone steps of the lighthouse tower, rushing into the high watchroom where the brilliant white beam was still rotating in its mechanical circle. He grabbed the emergency radio headset, his fingers trembling so much he nearly dropped it, and began broadcasting a desperate mayday call to the Coast Guard station on the mainland. He explained that the head keeper and second keeper had just suffered a catastrophic psychological break and entered the water at Blackwood Rock. The operator on the other end told him to stay calm, lock himself in the watchroom, and stay on the line. The operator stated that a rescue cutter was being deployed immediately, but because of the 20-mile distance, it would take at least 3 hours to reach his coordinates. Thomas sat on the floor of the watchroom, his back pressed against the solid stone wall, clutching the radio headset to his ear like a lifeline. He kept his eyes glued to the dark stone staircase, terrified that whatever had driven Marcus and Jacob over the edge was still lurking in the lower levels of the tower. An hour passed in absolute, agonizing silence. The mechanical hum of the rotating light above him was the only sound in the room. But then, at exactly 5:22 a.m., the radio headset went completely dead with a sharp burst of static. At that exact second, the temperature in the watchroom plummeted, the air turning so bitterly cold that Thomas could see his own breath forming a thick cloud in front of his face. He looked up at the massive glass lenses above him. The rotating mechanism began to slow down, the brilliant white beam whining to a halt until it stopped completely, aimed directly out into the empty eastern horizon. Thomas stood up, his body shaking from the intense chill. He shone his flashlight down the winding stairs, his ears straining against the silence. From the absolute darkness of the basement generator room, 90 feet below his feet, he heard a sound. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy, soaking, wet footsteps slowly beginning to ascend the stone stairs. Squish, squish, squish. And then a low, mechanical whisper began to echo up through the stone structure of the tower. It was Marcus's voice, but it was distorted, carrying a wet, bubbling resonance as if it were being spoken through a throat full of salt water. The voice thanked Thomas for staying on watch and told him that the water below was finally warm enough for all of them. We spend so much of our lives investing in the illusion of control, believing that our logic, our routines, and our structures are enough to protect us from the chaotic forces of the world. We build massive towers of stone to conquer the darkness, but we forget that the most dangerous elements are not always the storms we can track on a weather map. Sometimes, the true test of human nature is found in how we handle the absolute silence when the structures we rely on fail, and when we are forced to realize that some depths are never meant to be measured by human metrics. The Coast Guard rescue cutter arrived at Blackwood Rock at exactly 8:45 a.m. that morning. They found the lighthouse completely operational, the generator running smoothly, and the lenses perfectly clean. The logbook was sitting neatly on the desk in the watchroom, with a final entry written in Thomas's neat, precise handwriting, stating that the station was secure and the keepers were resting. But the island was completely empty. Thomas, Marcus, and Jacob were never seen again, and their clothes were found piled neatly on the concrete landing platform, completely dry. I am actually planning to take a coastal ferry past that sector of the Maine wilderness next month just to see if the light from that old stone tower still looks white from the water. We will be returning with another deep dive into the unexplained very soon. Until then, stay safe